Welcome to the Deal Flow podcast. Ryan right here, as always. And I got another guest on today. Eric, how's it going?
I'm doing great, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. We'll give a quick introduction to who you are, where you're at, what you do, and we'll get into uh, this particular episode in just a second.
Sure. My name's Eric Crouse. I'm a partner at Exit Value Partners, which is a subset of Kommit and Company. We are a sell-side M&A firm. We've been in existence for 20, I think 1 or 2 years now. We are former owners who have gotten into the transactions business and represent owners selling across the globe, but predominantly North America, anywhere between 3 and 100 million.
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of the M&A guys I come across are like myself. They're former owners who have sold a business. I don't do sell side work, obviously, but it's there's a lot of people who sell their business and they get into advising people on selling their business. And yet there's kind of a stigma around using a sell side advisor or broker or whatever term you want to use. Why do you think that might be?
Good question. Is relative to the stigma, I think people look at it like, hey, why would I pay somebody to do something that I can do myself, especially for an entrepreneur, right? Entrepreneurs are interesting folks. And of course, I am one, but used to be one with my own company. Entrepreneurs are the most optimistic people in the world, Ryan. I mean, you'd have to say this, right? I mean, you have to be in order to get past all of the speed bumps and pitfalls and roadblocks that are in front of entrepreneurs every day. So I think naturally every entrepreneur says, hey, why would I take a piece of the deal that I've built up my whole career and give it to somebody else to sell it when I have a buyer calling me asking to buy it on my own? So I think that's where the stigma is based, certainly rational.
Yeah, it's funny. You call me optimistic. My wife calls me crazy. It just depends on the point of perspective. Sometimes,
I have yet on that tone, let's talk about how optimistic. I have yet to meet a business owner when we ask for projections to give me a set of projections which are lower than the year that they were in. So
exactly.
we're all going up.
Exactly. Okay. So, a couple things. Let's go. Let's kind of get through. So as a sell side advisor, obviously you're representing the seller. But really it seems the more sell side advisors I talk to, they're not representing both sides, but they do play kind of that intermediary role where they're trying to make sure all parties are on the same path. But you also have to know what a good buyer wants, right? And how to find a good buyer. And that's part of what you're trying to do is bring a buyer that's going to pay the most money. And so it's kind of like fishing. If you're going to go fishing, you got to have the right bait. You got to have the right thing to attract a good buyer. So maybe let's go through a few things that you found that you would say good buyers or high quality buyers, having to phrase that, are looking for, and then why those things are important.
Can I give you a quick story about fishing?
Yeah, I love fishing. So yeah.
This will tie right into it. So years and years ago, I was in the direct marketing business back when I had a contact center. And we were doing, as part of a company that we were with, we were doing optimization, performance coaching, and then we were helping underwrite some financing for infomercials. You remember, just wait. Oh, what do they say? But
Uh,
wait, there's more.
Wait, there's more. Yeah.
So a gentleman down in Florida had this invention called a magic fishing snake, and I had to go down and meet with him. And for most of the day, we went out and cast this like 8-inch snake into these ponds around Central Florida, trying to find the biggest bass. And he thought it was the next best thing in fishing. Didn't catch a single thing. And then just after lunch, Doug Hannon came on the boat. I don't know if you remember him. He was called the Bass Professor.
Mm-mm. I
And
don't know
he
that
tied
name.
the tiniest little lure on the
Mhm.
end of his line, and he caught like every fish there was possible. And it was kind of gave me the idea that, you could be in the best pond, you could be in the best boat, you could have the biggest lure, right? But that's knowledge. The knowledge that you lack is what are they biting on today, right? And I think that goes to what we're talking about here on this podcast. And if you're going to sell, I don't care what it is, right? You want to know what that buyer or the ideal buyer is looking for, right? That's going to set you up for the best possible transaction, most repeatable, the highest price, et cetera. So I think before any sellers in business, people looking to sell what's typically the largest asset they'll ever own in their lives, I think one thing that's very important is for each seller to understand what the buyers in that market are looking for. And we'll go over 4 or 5 things today that I wish every seller knew or knows before they try to get into a transaction.
Yeah. Okay. So, I'll tell you what I always say. I'm curious if you would agree with this or not. I know it's on the list, but I'm curious if you'd say it's number one or not. I always tell potential sellers, and this is for perspective. I'm not talking to someone who's got a CFO, and I'm talking to average small business owners, right? So guys or gals are doing it themselves. They might have a bookkeeper, maybe their CPA is doing it, but they don't have a CFO on staff. The first thing I always say is make sure your books are good. They're clean, they're crisp. To me, that's always number one. Um, I know it's on the list for you. Is it number one, or is there a different one that you like number one?
I don't, it's funny, number one in terms of what the buyers want, or number one in terms of what should the sellers want, right? I think clean
Well,
financials are what
not
everyone
yeah,
wants.
yeah.
Let's
That's good. That's good.
let's take that one. That like that's universal. Like everybody wants that one.
Yeah.
And let's describe what clean means, right? Look, our tax code incentivizes us to run our books in such a way where it lowers our tax burden, right? And then every year we show the lowest possible profit. Finally, in one year, we decide to sell, and we've got to show the highest net income, adjusted EBITDA, SDE, whatever you want to call it, right? So we're doing two different things here. And I think buyers completely understand that. It's made up for in, the discretionary piece of the SDE or the adjustments in EBITDA. What we're trying to find, I'm not necessarily like the gold standard would be audited books. And let's face it, audits are expensive. Small business owners, it's probably not worth the ROI. Larger business, 15, 20, 30 million, it'd be worth the investment to have it audited. The next one would be reviewed by your accountant, and the last one would be compiled. And then below that are non-compiled, but financials. So what we like to see are books that are according to consistent accounting policies and procedures, hopefully in accordance with GAAP. We love accrual because buyers love accrual, but you can make a conversion from cash to accrual. What we're trying to find is that expenses and revenues over time go into the same buckets, right?
Mhm.
So, revenue A goes to revenue A, expense C goes to expense C. And over time, we can paint a picture for the buyer to which they can do due diligence and understand, okay, here are the financials based on invoices or receipts. Those ultimately become cash and deposits and bank records. And then everything, what they call ties out. So that everything makes sense either through a quality of earnings report or proof cash report, however you want to do it. But we want something that proves out. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be audited. We just want something that ties out.
Yeah, and okay, so I said it's number one, and you said, well, it depends on the perspective. I'm glad you clarified that. For me, what I'm pushing on there is, when I talk to an owner about selling, it seems that oftentimes, if I send them something like yourself or a PE group, one of the complaints is, "Hey, man, these books are a wreck. Like I don't even know to get started." So that's why I always talk about sellers. If you talk about selling, not today. If you're going to work with someone like your group or another group, then you guys can help with that. But if you're saying, "Hey, you know what? I'm considering selling next year, next 2 or 3 years. Now is the time to start getting the books in order." Right? That's you don't want to. The sooner you can do it, the better. It would seem.
Yeah, 100%. Obviously, you want to be on some type of a system. QuickBooks is, the most widely used system. You want something that can be exported, something that's not a manual Excel spreadsheet, if possible. QuickBooks is kind of the most used one out there, but you start there. Very consistent accounting power, really bookkeeping policies and procedures. And then from an accounting perspective, how you treat various things on the income statement and balance sheet are ultimately important because they will reflect what actually happened in the business. And you think about it from the buyer's perspective, what are they buying, right? They're buying a mechanism which will show profits long-term that they can recapture their investment and then make a certain amount going forward. So buyer's really trying to find something that says, okay, if I pay $1 for this, I'm going to make 10 cents a year, and I'm going to get that money back in 10 years.
Mhm.
And that's having clean financials is the first input into showing that payback period.
Yeah, and just one other final thing on this. This came up one time. I can't remember what the company was, but their margins were so high that no one would take them because it was, let's say it's supposed to be a 15 to 22% margin business, and they were doing like 45%. And the buyers were like, yeah, there's no way. M&A guys were like, yeah, we're not taking this to market. There's no way. It's just not, the books are too good to be true. And so, having the books that make sense because a good buyer is also going to understand kind of where those 17%, 21%, whatever the range is supposed to be, they're going to know the range. And so as long as you're in that range, it gives them a sense of, okay, this is good. But if you're way outside that range, you've now created a problem even by trying to make yourself look really good because they know that something's wrong with the business if you're saying that it's a 15 to 20% margin business and you're doing 47%. Something's wrong actually.
We heard that a few years ago. We sold a tree service, actually, and the buyers, which were private equity, they didn't believe the numbers. Now, 2 years after the transaction, they believe them fully. But going in, they certainly didn't believe them because this tree service, they had a particular moat. These guys are really, really good. And then they had to be proven out, however. There was a lot of skepticism based on what you're saying, though. Like, how are these guys so much better? But I think the buyer ultimately is thrilled that that acquisition does perform better than the marketplace and is now taking, those secrets from one acquisition and bleeding them across all the acquisitions so that everything improves.
Okay. So talked a little bit about money. Maybe stay there for a second. You mentioned every entrepreneur is always predicting this year's better than the next. Like that's, this year we're going to double or 10% or 100% or whatever growth. Telling a story of growth is important, I'm sure. Um, is having this flat line, like I do 2 million a year every year for the past 10 years. Is that a pro, that a con, that a negative? Versus no, I do 2.2, 2.4, 2.6, or did I be saying like 2, 3, 4? Like, does it matter? Is that industry specific? Do you have to show growth, or just being kind of a steady right there at the same level? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think it depends on where the company is in the life cycle of business. There's younger companies are more easily able to grow than older companies are, right? I mean, if you look at a 100-year-old company, they've pretty much captured market share versus a 2-year-old company, which maybe is just getting market share. So it depends on where the business is in the life cycle of companies. What buyers really want to see is some type of a stable growth or some stability there, right? If it goes from 1 million to 2 million to 4 million to 8 million, it's difficult to project what that value is going to be for that buyer long term, right? Is it going to go from 8 to 16, or is it going to go from 8 to 9 to 9.5? Right. So then basically, Ryan, that would come to a valuation issue. What we love to see are firms that change, obviously going higher, but predictably they can do that. Right. So they project, okay, we're going to say go from 2 to 2.4 million, and then they do it. And the next year, 2 to 2.4 to 2.8, something like that. Those are more easily able to be valued with any type of model. High growth, look, it's a great model. We love selling high growth. It's more difficult to come to an agreed upon valuation. Slow growth, easier to value. I think it gives a little bit more trust for the buyer, and they say, okay, we feel comfortable giving this a higher peg in valuation because it's done. Hopefully what it's going to do for us, it's done the last 5 years or 10 years, and it's going to continue to do the same thing. So buyers love stability.
Okay. And so that does bring a question up. How many years? I know, there's tech. Let's put the tech unicorns to the side. Your average business owner run a small business and maybe a service business or something like that. How many years do they need to be in business before they kind of say, okay, hey, this is where we're at, and this now we can go to market maybe to sell because I bought the business, I want to grow it, I want to sell it. Do they need to be around, or they start the business rather? Is it like 3 years, 5 years, 7 years? Does that matter? Can you sell a business that's 2 years old?
You could. It's a trickier transaction. I mean, typically let's assume everything we're talking about now is a startup. So you start at zero, right? So your first year of growth as a percentage is going to be incredible, right?
Right, right, right,
And then
right. You're
theoretically,
crushing
your
it.
second will be your less incredible, and third will be less incredible. But you get everything off that, it real quickly, the hockey stick goes up and to the right. Again, buyers are looking for stability. Not to say that those businesses are not sellable, but they won't trade on the type of multiples that a more stable, mature business will trade at, just because there's more risk. And you've got risk in a number of different categories, right? Risk from pricing in the marketplace, risk of products, if you have your own products that you've built, developed, manufactured, or marketing. If you're in new geographies that maybe are less mature, I think a lot of it comes down to org chart risk, right? You've had people on your business now for a year, 2 years. Are they going to stick around after a transaction? So younger businesses are inherently more risky. The risk will show up in the lower pricing. So they can be sold, but they will be sold at a lower valuation than a more mature company at a kind of a longer rate with longer tenured employees and clients, et cetera.
And I see that talking to owners. They're like, "Oh man, we're 3, 4 years in. We want to sell, but God, we're doubling up every year." And it's like, "Oh, okay. If you can double up every year for the next, 40 years, then yeah, never never sell this thing because but at some point the capital looks a lot different, right? You got more employees, you got more expenses. It's a lot harder to balance those things. And I think that is tough for owners, especially, a business that's less than 5 years that did want to grow it, does want to sell it. They try to get in the spot of, when do we kind of level this thing off? Because you can grow businesses extremely fast if you're good early on, and then to your point, you got to do something different to keep that growth rate going. Either bring a different business in, or new division or whatever. You mentioned org charts. Okay, this is a question we ask every potential seller. How involved in your business are you? And sometimes they will say, "Man, without me, this thing can't run." And I'm always like, "Oh, oh, uh-oh, uh-oh." Unless you're selling to the right buyer, you might have said the wrong answer. It's not always the terrible thing to say, but there's a lot of pride, as you mentioned, in starting a business or buying a business and running it and owning it. But to me, this is one of the things that um, I'm not sure all owners have a good understanding of why it's important to possibly separate themselves from the business if they're looking to sell, and how to go about that. Like, who should they be bringing in to help them? From an org chart perspective, who should they be bringing in to help them kind of step away so that it is transferable to someone else?
Probably the two most important questions, even before you consider a transaction, though, the number one would be, why am I selling? Right? I mean, do I want to go do other things? Am I retiring? Am I getting divorced? I mean, do I have some type of a terminal health condition, right? All those things need to be fleshed out, and that kind of sets the tone for the strategy of both the seller and the buyer. Younger organization, let's say we've got a younger organization that's 3 years in, and the owner says, "Look, I love doing IT. I'm an IT company. I hate HR. I hate sales. I hate doing accounts receivable. So I want to keep working, but I just want to spin 3 plates instead of 12." Right. So that's a different rationale than the owner who's 65 and has an HVAC company, no children in the business, no real succession plan, and says, "Look, I just want to retire." Right. So understanding your why is really, really important. Right. From there, once you kind of get your why down, really the next thing to go about is, how am I going to transition out of this thing? Right? Do I handle, right, all of the sales? Do I handle all of the client services? Do I handle the accounting, the finance? Do I handle the HR, the hiring, et cetera? And what we try to say to owners, we came up with this thing called the PACT team, PACT. And this is a really, really important thing. So the people who handle, or the executives or supervisors and managers who handle your sales, that's your people process. Sorry, let's do people process first, right? So your HR and your process. So if it's HVAC, who are your technicians, who handles your HR, et cetera. A is accounting, finance. C is clients, either new or existing. And T is technology. And look, every business utilizes some type of technology, whether it's someone carving headstones or, an MSP. So the PACT team, those 4 people, or the people who are running those 4 departments, if they are already in existence in the company and will transition with the owner, then that business will be ready to sell. So kind of go to, why am I selling, and is this business ready to sell? And having a solid org chart there is really at the top of minds of a lot of buyers, because they can maintain that stability and predictability of just the service level of the business, right? It's going to continue even after this owner departs, retires, et cetera. Does
Yeah,
that make sense?
yeah, no, it makes sense. And then I'm thinking, if I'm a business owner, I'm trying to grow a business, or bring these people in to help me sell. How do I ensure that they want to stay on after a transaction so that the buyer wants to buy? Like, they may all leave. So is that part of a contract negotiation? Is that incentivizing them? Like, how do you keep these key people around from the seller standpoint so that the buyer, is wanting to, bring them on and transition them as well?
Again, kind of going back to the why, right? The two different things. If you have a younger seller who's selling to a larger org, let's say a PE firm, and they want to stay on board, then that's an easier task to go to your team and say, look, here's why we're doing it, right? We're going to be able to do more with less. We're going to be able to go from a $5 million company to a $100 million company. We'll have more things to sell. We'll have more backup. Maybe all of us can go home and stop answering emails at 5 o'clock on Friday night, all those things. If an owner wants to retire, right, then it's more important that they really meet with, hopefully, you got to be careful on this one. This is a really, really sensitive topic. Like, who do you tell in your organization that you're selling? Because you might lose people before you even start a transaction. So you have to be very cognizant of there is risk here in bringing people on board. However, there's also risk in telling your people too late that I've sold this. So you need buy-in, and whether that comes through, agreements you have with existing or key employees, or you have a frank conversation with them and say, look, this is what I'm going to do and why I'm going to do it. And I think the big thing, Ryan, is to understand, based on your why, that the strategy has to involve finding the right buyer, right? It's not as easy just to say, okay, this person called me, I'm going to sell to them. What we as advisors do primarily is we find the right fit, right? And the right fit means, for the owner who wants to retire, all the stakeholders that he or she cares about are taken care of during the transaction. So that means your clients, your employees, your vendors, et cetera. You make sure that buyer is going to do what you want with the company after you are no longer there. Now, a lot of times that comes down to just, do I like this person? Do we have similar goals? Do we look at our industry and the world the same way? And Ryan, what we find is 99 out of 100 times that if you put the fit first, not only do you have higher retention from your employees and your clients, but ultimately you wind up getting the highest selling price.
No, I mean, I think about a year and a half ago, I kind of cobbled together this saying, which is sales is the right offer to the right prospect at the right time. And ultimately what that means is, there's all these things about how to be a great closer and how to do all this stuff. But ultimately, if you find the right fit and you talk to them at the right time, it becomes really easy to make a sale. And the same thing here is when you're selling a business, it's two people or people or group of people, whatever it is. And so it has to be a fit, like trying to convince someone to buy or to sell. Um, there's so much human element that gets lost in some of this. I'll talk to people and they go, why would anybody ever sell their business? It's like, well, I don't know. They're humans. They have a lot of reasons. Like, you've touched on some of them. Some of them just, they don't like doing what they're doing anymore. Some of them have made a bunch of money. Some of them want to move. Some of them get divorced. And we, the M&A space needs more exposure, I think. And it needs more exposure in the human element as well, because it's just humans doing a transaction is all that it is. And so aligning incentives and values and stuff like that, gets talked about, I think, kind of in those meetings, but outside, it's like, oh, we're going to sell a business, and it's like, yeah, that's a very human to human transaction, and a lot of things need to be aligned other than just the financials.
100%. If you think about it and I hate to call anybody's business small, right? Because it's a big piece of their life. It's a big piece of their career.
Sure.
It's represented a lot of things. It's typically the largest asset they'll ever own in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes it's the most risky. It represents their retirement, right? Their nest egg, their kids' inheritance, their, dreams of, having a second vacation home. It represents a lot of things are captured in that asset, and a lot of personality to it as well. And a lot of times it means, frankly, as much to them as not just career, but it could be a part of their personality. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to put it above family, right? But let's face it, it's their baby.
It is.
And I think from our perspective for sell side advisors, at least the ones who are similar to us in the spirit that when it comes time for that owner to ultimately monetize that asset, we want to make sure it's done in a way that not only gets the highest valuation, right, but is treated with the proper amount of care to make sure not only sold at the highest price, all of the stakeholders' interests are aligned, and then ultimately it transitions in the way that the owner would want the first time. It's
Mm-hmm.
hard to sell a business 2 and 3 and 4 times. You don't want to fail in the transaction. And really the percentage, I think what we get paid for is not so much, the technical, the numbers, the analysis. I think really what we get paid for is to manage the personalities into finding that ideal buyer. That's the difference, I think, between selling it on your own or going to, your basic, um, selling it through a friend who sells, let's say, real estate, for example. Like we've done a lot of research in the industries, and we're going to go through a long process and find that right buyer. So that way, ultimately, comes time to transact, it goes well, full monetization, and you look back years later and say, you know what, that was a really, really good experience.
I know we're up against the clock. Do you have a few extra minutes, or do you have a hard
I have
stop?
plenty of time. Yeah.
Okay, good. So we had two more things I wanted to go over. Um, I had a deal last year for a client. The company experienced hockey stick growth, crazy growth. I mean, they're like 3 or 4 years old, going crazy. One of the issues was 70. I mean, these guys are doing, I don't know, 40 million a year, something like that. After like 3, 4 years in, it was crazy. But 75, 85% of the revenue came from one client. And it's really tough because for this owner, they have to take care of that client for obvious reasons, but they also want to take care of them for other obvious reasons, right? So they have to take care of them because that's what's growing their business. But you'd be foolish not to take care of a customer from just a logical perspective who has helped grow your business from nothing to 30 or $40 million in revenue. Um, and yet, from an exit standpoint, it's not very attractive because if Bob leaves and the client gets mad, then 85% of the company or whatever it is gone. So how do you think about balancing that? Because it's very personal, especially with your clients. You get very personal. You want to take care of them, and they're giving you a ton of work. You want to do good service, and you're afraid if you expand, you might not provide that same level of service, and then you've lost two clients instead of one. But on the flip side, to sell your business, having one customer that's 75 and 85% of your business seems pretty risky unless maybe there's a contract. Is there exceptions to that rule? How do you think about customer concentration? I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, buyers hate customer concentration with a caveat. It depends on who the client is, right? If it's a really coveted client that the buyer can't get, or maybe they lost out on the contract and they want it, then you can overcome that hurdle. Typically it's an issue because if that one client goes, or if you have two or three that represent over half of the revenue, it's a big risk to the buyer. They don't know how that relationship is between the seller and the client immediately, right? They're like, I don't know if it's a good relationship, a great relationship, bad, or whoever. They don't know who owns that client relationship. Is that client the brother-in-law, right? Is it the uncle? Is it the nephew of the owner? They don't know that. So typically what we see that is handled in terms of structure, Ryan. A little bit of valuation decrease, but it's structure. So if you want to get paid on a big client and it represents a large part of your revenue stream, kind of two things. If you're going to stick around and manage that client, it's your relationship, then you may be asked to stay for 2, 3, 4 years, right? If you want to retire or you want to go do something else, then that will typically be handled through some type of an earnout structure, which we, do our best to avoid earnouts. However, sometimes you got to take them, otherwise you leave money on the table. So it can be de-risk. When you ever hear de-risk in a transaction, that means lower price or more difficult structure, right? But a big problem with M&A is the asymmetry of risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not like two big public companies where I know everything there is to know about them because all of their financials are filed and public to
Mm-hmm.
me. They don't produce annual reports. A lot of these things are accomplishing, crossing that risk bridge is what we call it. And that's what a good advisor will put a plan together before you go to market and say, okay, here's probably what the market's going to say, and here's going to be our counter argument to that. Make sure that's acceptable to the owner before you go to market. Prepare them for any potential contingencies or de-risking,
Mm-hmm.
and then ultimately go into it with eyes open. And if we found the right buyer, they will understand and hopefully put a structure together that makes everybody happy.
What about assignability of contracts for those customers? Is that a problem, a concern? Only certain types of deals? I hear that from time to time come up is, the contracts aren't assignable. Is that an asset transaction only, equity transaction? When does that
Yeah,
become a problem?
typically, predominantly we see asset. purchases, not stock purchases. There's a number of different reasons for that. The number one reason is just better for the buyer from a tax perspective to buy assets. They do hopefully remove themselves from any carry forward liabilities that are unknown to them. So most purchases are asset purchase. In that event, you would want to make sure that your contracts with your clients, if you have revenue that's generated based on contracts, are all assignable for change of control. Now, sometimes you'll have a notice provision in there that the seller will have to give notice to the client that they are selling the business. That's not preferable. What you really want is pure assignability. Now, in a stock transaction, you can get away from all of that because you're virtually buying the company as is, carry forward liabilities and all. And then typically then the notice provision wouldn't necessarily kick in. I mean, it could, but it depends on how they're written. And then you wouldn't have to worry about assigning contracts. But
Gotcha.
either way, either scenario, you can still sell the company. The preferred way is to, if you generate revenues based on contracts, have an assignability clause in the contracts.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So we talked about representation a few times. Let's dig into it. You know,
This is the big one.
this is the big one because as you know what we do, which is talk to sellers about selling their business every day. We
Yeah.
don't represent sell side ever,
Yeah.
but we do talk to them about that. And at the end of every call, I always say, "Do you want to deal with the buyer directly, or do you want an advisor or broker?" I always ask that question, and they about 80% of the time they say, "I don't know. I don't. What do you think?" And I kind of go through the pros and cons of each. But I have my opinion on pros and cons. Let's hear your opinion first, and then I'll maybe ask some questions about what I think some of the pros and cons are going a direct buyer route. And I'm saying direct buyer, that could be a strategic, could be private equity. Those are different types of acquisitions, of course, but it is a direct buyer versus going with an advisor slash broker.
So let's talk about the data first, and then we'll talk about the emotions later,
Mhm.
because I think those are the two biggest elements you need to consider when deciding whether to use a representative or not. So the data, if you use a sell side advisor, you're on average going to get 25% higher selling price. Now, that's a study out of University of Alabama, I think. I can send you the link to it. But on average, and they studied thousands of transactions, you'll get about 25% lift in transaction value. The other piece is you're going to be 3 times more likely to sell. So if you want a higher chance of selling and a higher price, use an advisor. That's the data. The emotional piece of it, and kind of going back to, I guess, two things. Number one, it's a very, very time consuming process. It could be as fast as 3 months or as long as 12 months or even longer to sell your company. Our work, we have 7 of us on board. We spend a ton of time not only preparing the company for sale, presenting it to the market, negotiating with the market, but then ultimately getting through all of the big contracts. You could have as many as 4 or 6 or 8 different legal agreements in one transaction, all of which have to be negotiated. It takes a long time. Due diligence takes a long time. So one thing we hate to see is when an owner decides to sell and they don't use a representative, they're going to take their eye off of the ball of running their company to its detriment while they are in the process of selling. If and when that happens, you'll see a lower selling price if things are pegged on trailing 12 months. So we hate to see that happen. I think the other thing too, from an emotional perspective, is, this is the owner's baby. At some point in time, the buyer, someone on their side, is going to tell you that your baby's ugly. Okay.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that's
that's true.
hard to hear. And
That's
once
true.
you hear it, you kind of jolt back and say, well, what are you talking about? And they could be making a comment about, hey, I don't like how you did these financials, or I don't like your contracts, I don't like your org charts, something that would be fairly objective. But as soon as an owner hears that, it immediately gives them kind of an emotional jolt, which if we're an advisor and we're in the middle, we can handle that, couch it a little bit and talk with the seller about, okay, here's something that the buyer doesn't really like. How can we counteract that to make sure that we continue down the transaction road? And I think that's a big one. The one thing we really hate to see is when owner goes it alone and either winds up leaving money on the table or the transaction just doesn't go through for reasons that an advisor could have prevented.
Yeah. So what I usually say to sellers is if you know what you want to get for the company, like you say, hey, $5 million, pick a number, and you're happy if it's going to be seven and you're going with five for some reason, because some people they want to get out quick, they're happy to lose $2 million, they need to go. But you said, say, hey, if you know what you want for the company, you have someone that you know will pay you that money, um, and you're willing to go through the process, then yeah, maybe it is better to go solo, or to talk to a one-off buyer. But if you don't know the value of your company, you don't know how to go through this process. You don't know how to do that stuff. Then you need to talk to an advisor or broker. And most people at that point realize they don't know the value of their company, right? They go, because that's the core problem. I know what my tax return says. I know what I make, but what will someone pay for it? I don't know. We talked to a group last year. They valued their company at, I don't remember. We'll say it's 10, $11 million. The advisor valued it at $30 million. Right. And I don't do valuations, but he told me the valuation. I knew it was way off based upon what he said. And so we talked to an advisor. He realized he was 3x off what he thought. Um, but if you said, hey, I want to sell it to, my partner, or I got an employee I want to sell it to. I don't want to take it to market. I want to give it to them, or I have someone I want to sell it to, and I want to get this for it. Then yes, then maybe that is the path for you. But if you want to go to a broader market and try to start getting bids and stuff like that in there, it's almost impossible to do. It's not a for sale by owner that you can put on Zillow and work that process. I mean, we had a broker tell us today they spend 300 to 400 hours on a deal. I don't know if is that what you guys spend on like one of your transactions. That's a ton of time.
Oh yeah, I mean that's if you add up all the team members for sure, I mean that's probably an average transaction.
Yeah. So I mean, what would you say? So if would you agree if you kind of say, hey, I had a fractional CFO, or I got a valuation from somewhere and it's worth this, and if I got Bob over here, or my cousin Sally or whatever, they want to buy it. I'm happy to sell it to them, or someone sent me an email, and they want to buy it for this. It's a one-off deal. I want to do this. Would you say then maybe sell it on your own, or even then bring in a broker if they don't go through the process for whatever reason?
Well, yeah, I don't know what other brokers charge. I mean, I know what we charge. Our average rate is like 5 or 6% on a transaction.
Hmm.
And that's lower middle market. So that's kind of under, 30, 40 million.
Hmm.
I promise you're going to have ROI. That's going to be your highest ROI on anything that you'll spend. Like you're going to make more money on that 5 or 6 than you'll make on the attorney's fees. And it'll probably
Right.
save you a lot of attorney's fees over the long haul. I mean, the big thing that that sell side reps bring to the table is a competitive bidding process.
Hmm.
So like what you're talking about is if I've got an invention in the automobile, industry and Chevy calls me, says, I want to buy it. Is that a good deal? You might think, hey, that's a great deal. But you go to an advisor and be like, well, actually Ferrari would pay you twice that, but
Right.
Tesla would pay you 10 times that, right?
Right.
You're not going to have that knowledge because you're not interacting with these buyers on a daily basis. For the industries that we cover, we spend a long time with each prospective buyer and understand, do they have the money to buy you or a firm like yours? What is their appetite? What do they want to do with it? Can they integrate it? What do they want to do with it long term? So before we even take it to market, the firm to market, we already know, where our best chances of success will be and who will pay the highest
Hmm.
valuation.
Hmm.
Right. And then from there, we basically take the owner's goals and we make a strategy around their goals. So, I mean, going it alone happens. We cover a technology space where there are 1,200 transactions in 2022, and less than 10% of them use a sell side advisor.
Yeah.
If you go to what I said at the top, the 25%, we bring 25% extra to the table. That's a lot of money left on the table. And that 25%, Ryan, basically comes from making sure each firm is prepared,
Hmm.
understanding that person, that seller's desires and wants, building a strategy around it, but then getting that competitive bidding marketplace, which changes the whole calculus when
Hmm.
you talk about selling your business. Because not only can you find the right buyer, but you can get the right terms and at your valuation.
Yeah. And most owners that we send to a direct buyer come back to us and it doesn't work out. And we end up selling to a sell side broker anyways, because they kind of experience it. You know, I dip my toe in the water, and it's like doing a for sale boat on your house, except for 1,000 times more complicated. People are calling, they want this, they need that. Why is this wrong? And it's like, oh, okay, yeah, let's go that way. So it is possible. But you're right, and sometimes it's a seller needs to experience what it's like before they realize what it's like. You know, it's one of those things you don't
Oh,
know
I
what it's
hate
like
that.
before.
Oh, I hate it. It's expensive. I mean, look, if you want to sell your house, right? A realtor's going to come say, "Hey, let's paint this room. Let's kind of fix that up. New curtains over here,
Mhm.
et cetera." Right? And that's what an advisor will do as well. And then it gets expensive. Not so much on a real estate perspective, but on a company perspective, because you've got to hire, typically you're hiring an M&A attorney,
Mhm.
without going in down that rabbit hole, those can get crazy expensive. There are some guys out there now who are doing it on a flat fee. I think that model is phenomenal. I think I mean, beyond time for that to hit the marketplace. But an M&A attorney, an average deal can be, 15 to $50,000, no problem. So before you spend that and get nothing at the end, meet with an advisor and understand if what you want is possible. And if it is, develop your strategy around it. And again, your ROI in an advisor, I promise you, is going to be probably 2 to 3, 5, 10 to 1. For every
Mhm.
dollar you spend, you're going to get a lot of dollars back.
Okay, we'll let you with this last question. The biggest pushback we get from using a sell-side advisor is, I don't want someone to put it on a website or to send out an email blast, and that's all I do. And that is a big stigma that sellers have about the industry, is that a lot of brokers, advisors, they're just putting it on Biz Buy Sell or Axial or whatever it is, Craigslist, whatever
Yeah,
it
yeah,
is. They're hitting
yeah.
publish, and that's it. What would you say to that?
Yeah, for the generalist out there who's selling what we call Main Street business, um, hair salons, nail salons, pizza shops, restaurants, et cetera, they cover so many industries that they almost have to do that because they don't have enough time to go and research the particular buyers of either an industry or a geography. For specialists like myself, we cover six, hard and fast industries. I mean, we'll sell things outside of that, but typically we try to stay in our specialties. We spend a lot of time getting to know the buyers, getting to know how the things are valued and sold. I think if you can go with a specialist, then definitely go with a specialist, right? And that would alleviate your concerns because it won't be something that's cast out in the marketplace and just say, "Hey, this is for sale." Confidentiality is obviously, it's paramount to our longevity in the business, and we take it very, very seriously. However, I understand that concern. If you're selling a tire shop, then find a specialist who sell an M&A representative in tire shops. If you sell, rocket launchers, then find an M&A specialist in rocket launchers. But I think I totally get that concern, and I think the Main Street business broker is incredibly important as far as a service leader in our industry. However, if that's your concern, then find somebody who has specialty in that. And the nice thing now is they can be anywhere, right? We're all working from home. We all work remote. Everybody gets it. The old days of on-site, visits from buyers are, I don't want to say over, but they're much diminished. People will buy companies remote, believe it or not. So I think having somebody in your particular hometown who's a specialist is not a requirement. There's some great M&A firms in Texas where you are who handle things around the country. Like I said, our firm is global. We'll handle things virtually around the globe, save 8 or 10 places. But
Awesome. Okay. Well, where can people connect with you, your firm? Where do you want us to send people
well, obviously they can find me through calling you, Ryan. But yeah, exitvp.com is our website. And I'm on LinkedIn, Eric Crouse, Crouse.
Okay. We will link to your company's website and your LinkedIn in the show notes. And thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Ryan, thanks so much. Appreciate you having me.